You arrive at your desk at 8:47. A spreadsheet is open. A meeting request pings at 8:52. But none of this is about work. It never was. The fluorescent hum is a specific frequency. It was chosen because it costs the least to run per square foot in Brazil, in Poland, and Texas. No one designing that sound ever asked what it does to your cortisol at 3 in the afternoon. No one who installs those ceiling panels has ever needed to write a single paragraph of deep analytical prose in a room full of 47 other people. But you have. And you already know the difference between the space you think you get and the space you actually inhabit. There is a term for the gap between what a company says it values and what it actually rewards. In academic literature, it is called performative corporate culture. In your body, it is called exhaustion. And the numbers that prove this gap exist, but most companies will never measure them because the measurement itself would expose the design flaw. In 1982, two consultants named Tom Peters and Robert Waterman published a book called In Search of Excellence. It sold over 3 million copies. It popularized the very term corporate culture. Before that book, the phrase barely existed outside anthropology journals. After it, every boardroom in America suddenly wanted a culture. But here is what no one in those boardrooms ever admitted. What they wanted was not a culture. What they wanted was a control system that felt like freedom. Patagonia is the company most often cited as the authentic exception. 1% of sales goes to environmental causes. Their mission statement reads, "We are in business to save our home planet." That mission is real. The tax records prove the donations. The supply chain audits exist. But Patagonia is also the brand that proved the exception enough to sell billions of dollars of fleece jackets. Authenticity became a premium product line. Now consider what happens when authenticity is absent. In 2001, Enron collapsed. Before the collapse, Enron had a corporate culture statement that emphasized words like innovation, integrity, and respect. Those words were printed in employee handbooks, carved into lobby walls, repeated at all hands meetings. And behind that language, executives were fabricating financial statements to hide billions of dollars in debt. The disconnect between the words and the behavior was not a failure of culture. It was a feature of a system that used culture language as a shield. Here is what the data says about your lived experience. A 2021 Gallup survey measured employee belief in corporate authenticity across multiple industries. Only 26% of employees across the global workforce said they believe their company's corporate culture is genuine. 1 in 4. The other 74% sit in meetings, watch presentations, read emails that use the same vocabulary, and feel the gap between those words and what actually happens. The 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer looked at a different angle. They asked employees whether they trusted their CEO to tell the truth. Only 47% said yes, less than half. Which means that in any given company meeting room, more than half the people in that room assume the person at the front is performing a version of reality that does not match what they see. If you have ever sat through a values alignment workshop where the facilitator said the word transparency while the executive team was preparing layoffs that had already been decided 6 weeks earlier, you already understand the gap. The workshop was not a failure of communication. It was a containment ritual, a method of managing attention until the real decision could be executed without disruption. That word disruption is central to understanding what is happening. In ordinary language, disruption means chaos or interruption. In corporate language, disruption has been rebranded as a positive trait. But the experience of disruption inside a system that claims to value collaboration is never positive. It is the feeling of being pulled off your task by a conversation at the next desk, a shoulder tap, a chat notification, a meeting that could have been an email. And here is the part that feels like gaslighting. You are told that those interruptions are collaboration. The noise is energy. The visibility is accountability. And if you disagree, if you put on headphones, if you close your door, if you say no, you are the problem. You do not fit the culture. The real definition of performative corporate culture is not hard to find. It is a system that broadcasts one set of values publicly while rewarding a different set of behaviors internally. The words on the wall say integrity, but the person who gets promoted is the one who managed the narrative best, not the one who delivered the highest quality work. The words on the wall say innovation, but the person who questions a flawed process is labeled difficult. The words on the wall say people first, But the person who leaves at 5 to pick up their child is quietly marked as not committed. You have just read the manual of your own workplace. That gap between what is said and what is rewarded, you live inside it. If you want to keep discovering why that gap exists and how to name it in real time, subscribe so the next piece of the pattern reveals itself to you. And in the comments, drop the word that your company's mission statement says, but its actions contradict: integrity, innovation, people first. Let us see which values are actually being hollowed out. You know this. You have felt it. And the reason you keep watching videos like this one is not because you want to be angry. It is because you want someone to name the thing you cannot name in meetings. You want a vocabulary for the gap you live inside every day. So let us name it. The term corporate culture was never an organic description. It was a management technology that emerged in the 1980s to solve a specific problem. That problem was the post-war workforce that had begun to distrust authority. Vietnam, Watergate, the petroleum crisis. Workers in the late 1970s no longer assumed the company was benevolent. So the company stopped saying obey and started saying belong. The values replaced the rules. The mission replaced the order. Same hierarchy, different packaging. The Harvard Business Review study from 2023 reported that 82% of companies have official value statements, but only 37% of employees see those values reflected in daily decision-making. That is a gap of 45 percentage points. That gap is not invisible to employees. It is the thing they complain about at lunch, in group chats, in exit interviews. It is the reason so many organizations have a retention problem they cannot solve by raising salaries, because the salary was never the real issue. The real issue was the cognitive cost of pretending that the words and the reality are the same thing. Now consider the architecture of the physical space that most of you work in right now. The open plan office was not designed for your productivity. It emerged from a 1968 design competition that prioritized density and cost reduction over human cognitive performance. The company Herman Miller popularized the Action Office system, which was later stripped of its partitions, reimagined as the cubicle farm, and then stripped again until only the desks remained. Open offices saved the company an average of 30% on real estate costs. That is the real purpose. Not collaboration, not culture, cost. But they are sold to you as culture. And that is the deeper mechanism. When a company tells you that the open office is about transparency and teamwork, they are asking you to accept a story that contradicts your own sensory data. You feel the noise. You feel the loss of focus. You feel the 40-second tasks that take 29 minutes to re-enter after each interruption. But the official story says, this is good for you. The gap between what you experience and what you are told to believe is the performative culture engine at work. At Zappos, the online shoe retailer, the experiment was explicit. They adopted a management system called Holacracy, which eliminated traditional managers and promised radical self-organization. They also offered new hires $2,000 to quit after the first week, a method designed to weed out anyone who did not truly believe in the culture. That is a tool that measures commitment. But it also creates a selection pressure. Only people willing to accept the official story survive. Dissent filters itself out. The problem is that authenticity cannot be filtered into existence. It is not a hiring outcome. It is a structural property of how decisions are actually made. If the decision-making process inside the company contradicts the value statement, no amount of recruitment filtering will close the gap. Here is the image you should hold. Imagine a building with two sets of documents. In the lobby, a plaque. It lists the company values: respect, integrity, collaboration. On the third floor, in a locked cabinet, the incentive structure: bonuses tied to quarterly revenue targets, not long-term outcomes. Promotions based on visibility to senior leadership, not depth of contribution. The plaque and the cabinet contradict each other. The culture is the cabinet. The plaque is the marketing. Several years ago, a large technology company conducted an internal study. They found that employees who aligned with the official culture language were no more productive than those who openly disagreed with it. Alignment did not predict output. It predicted only the likelihood of being selected for leadership programs. Culture alignment was not a productivity metric. It was a conformity test. This is the point where the investigator voice must ask the uncomfortable question. If culture alignment does not predict better work, why is it measured and enforced so heavily? The answer is that corporate culture is not about work. It is about control. A workforce that believes it belongs to a shared mission is a workforce that supervises itself. It does not need as many managers. It disciplines its own outliers. It accepts lower pay in exchange for identity. The culture is not the environment you work in. It is the environment that works for the organization. You need to know that the people who study organizational behavior know this. They have a term for it. They call it cultural control. It means replacing formal rules with internalized norms. If you believe you are part of a family, you will work weekends without being asked. If you believe the mission matters, you will skip vacation. The family language is not a sentiment. It is a management lever. And when the lever breaks, when the gap between the words and the reality becomes too wide to ignore, you get what researchers call cynicism, reduced engagement, higher turnover, quiet quitting. These are not failures of individual motivation. They are rational responses to a system that asked you to believe something that was never true. The 72% of disengaged employees are not lazy. They are accurate. Let me tell you what happens next in the cycle. The company sees disengagement. It responds by doubling down on culture, more workshops, new values, a rebranded mission, a town hall where the CEO says we need to get back to our roots. And every employee in that room does the math. They compare the new words to the old decisions. The gap does not close. The cynicism deepens. And the next employee who leaves will not write the real reason in their exit interview because they have learned that honesty about the gap is not rewarded. The gap between what you hear and what you live is not a failure of your perception. It is the raw data of a system built on two different truths. If you want to keep tracing these invisible mechanisms, subscribe, because the next layer of this story shows you exactly how researchers quantify the distance between fantasy and reality. Drop one word in the comments, the word you would use to describe the space between what they say and what you feel. One of the most cited studies in organizational psychology asked employees to describe their company culture in one sentence, and then asked leaders to do the same. The two descriptions rarely matched. The leaders described the culture they wanted. The employees described the culture they lived in. The gap between those two sentences is the distance between fantasy and reality, and that distance is the price you pay every day. For the next part of the video, you need to know that it is possible to close the gap, but it requires something most leaders are unwilling to do. It requires telling the truth about the incentive structure and changing it. Not the words, the structure. Most companies stop at the words, and that is why the culture feels fake. Here is the mechanism. Every time a company holds a values workshop without changing the promotion criteria, they are not improving culture. They are training employees to accept cognitive dissonance as normal. They are teaching the workforce that the official language is unrelated to actual outcomes. And eventually the workforce learns that language is noise. I want you to recall the earlier number. 26% believe the culture is real. That means 74% of the global workforce has learned to decode the noise correctly. They know the values are not the system. They know the website is not the experience. They know the mission statement is a preface to a different book. And yet they show up every day and perform the belief because the alternative is to leave, and leaving has its own costs. The 2022 Edelman data also found something else. Trust in CEOs dropped by 12 percentage points over the past 5 years. It is not staying stable. It is declining. The longer a CEO stays in the same company, the lower the trust. Proximity to power does not generate belief. It generates exposure to the gap. The more you see how decisions are actually made, the less the official story works. There is a specific data point that captures this perfectly. Researchers presented employees with two versions of their company values, the official version and a rewritten version that described the actual behaviors rewarded. When asked which version their company would never endorse, 83% of employees identified the accurate version. They knew the truth. They just could not say it out loud. That is the definition of fake culture. Not that employees believe the lie, that they know the truth but must pretend they do not. You need to hear this clearly. If you have ever felt guilty about not believing the culture, that guilt was manufactured. You are not the broken component in the system. The gap is, and the gap belongs to the people who designed the contradiction between what they say and what they reward. Let us shift now to the sensory cost. The gap is not abstract. It manifests in your body. The reason you feel tired at the end of a day spent in meetings is not the meetings themselves. It is the energy cost of managing the mismatch between what you know and what you must appear to believe. That cost has a name. Psychologists call it emotional labor. It was first described by Arlie Russell Hochschild in 1983, studying flight attendants who had to smile at passengers who mistreated them. The smile was not optional. It was required. And the personal cost of maintaining that smile, of splitting your real feeling from your required expression, is measurable. It raises cortisol. It reduces immune function. It accelerates burnout. The same economy operates in corporate offices. The smile at the values workshop, the nodding during the CEO town hall, the agreement expressed in the meeting about the new mission. These are not collaboration. They are emotional labor. And emotional labor performed every day, inside a gap you cannot close, produces exhaustion. The 1980s bestseller by Peters and Waterman gave corporations a language to describe themselves as cultures. That language was useful. It created identity. It helped people feel part of something larger, but it also created the conditions for the current problem. Once you define the company as a culture, you define deviation from the culture as a personal failing. The word culture became a gate. You either fit or you do not. And if you do not fit, the problem is you, not the gap. But the evidence from the organizations that get it right tells a different story. The few companies where authenticity is consistently high share a pattern. They do not emphasize culture as a campaign. They emphasize decision integrity. The person who makes a decision that contradicts the stated values is publicly addressed. The incentive structure is aligned before the values are broadcast. The values are not a goal. They are a description of existing behavior. Patagonia, the company that gives 1% of sales to environmental causes, does not just say they care about the planet. They organize their entire supply chain to prioritize environmental audits over margin optimization. That is not a mission statement. That is a decision architecture. And decision architecture is the only thing that closes the gap. There is a word for the opposite of fake culture. It is integrity, not in the moral sense, in the structural sense. Integrity means that the system behaves as it claims. The words and the cabinet match. And when a company achieves that match, employees do not need to perform belief. They simply observe alignment. And observation does not require energy. It restores it. The next time you sit in a meeting where someone says the company values are respect and community, you have a question you can ask yourself. Not out loud, because that would cost you your job. But internally, you can ask, does the last promotion decision I remember reflect respect and community? If the answer is no, you have identified the gap, and you have just reclaimed your own accuracy. You are not the problem. The gap is the problem. And now you have the vocabulary to name it. I want you to write this in the comments. Not for me, for your own clarity. Write the words that were on the wall of your last company and the behavior that was actually rewarded. Those two things, side by side. Because naming the gap is the first step to refusing to perform inside it. And refusal, even silent refusal, is the beginning of recovery. Let me show you how the gap operates in real time. Imagine you work in a company that lists transparency as a core value. You attend a town hall where the CEO presents quarterly results. The revenue is down. The CEO says, "We are investing in long-term growth." What the CEO does not say is that the executive team approved a reorganization plan 12 days earlier that will eliminate your department. The revenue decline was not a surprise. It was a known variable. And the town hall was a performance designed to stabilize morale until the plan could be executed without panic. 26 days later, your manager calls you into a room and reads a script. "We are restructuring. Your role has been eliminated." The manager says they are sorry. They say they value your contribution, but they knew for 26 days while you sat through meetings where transparency was the word of the quarter. The gap between the word and the experience is not an accident. It is a process. A 2021 analysis of Fortune 500 companies found that the average gap between a CEO publicly expressing positive sentiment and the subsequent layoff announcement was 28 days. 28 days of pretending. 28 days of cultural performance. And employees are not naive. They feel the cold weeks. They know the tone shifted before the announcement came. The anxiety is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. You have to understand that the reason corporate culture feels fake is not because the people making the culture are lying all the time. Many of them believe their own words. The problem is structural. The incentives that drive corporate behavior are not aligned with the values that corporate communications produce. The Values Committee writes the language. The Finance Committee designs the bonus structure. Those two committees do not talk to each other. The gap is not malice. It is organizational design. The 1980s popularization of corporate culture as a management tool gave executives a new lever. Instead of changing the incentive system, you could describe a vision of who you wanted to be. The vision cost nothing. The incentive change cost everything. So the vision won. And every employee across every industry became a decoder of the distance between the vision and the paycheck. Here is a specific example that illustrates the mechanism at scale. A multinational corporation with headquarters in the United States ran a culture initiative for 18 months. They hired consultants. They ran focus groups. They printed new values cards. They hand-delivered them to every desk. The cost of the initiative was $4.7 million. 6 months after the launch, employee trust scores had dropped by 2%. The initiative had cost money and time, and it had made things worse, because the initiative was a reminder of the gap, not a closing of it. $4.7 million spent to remind every employee exactly how wide the gap really is. If that number stuck in your chest, you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe so you don't miss the next dissection of why corporate trust keeps bleeding and what the mechanisms look like when you trace the wiring. And in the comments, drop the dollar amount of the most expensive culture initiative you've ever sat through. I need to see what people are spending to make things worse. The problem was simple. The values mentioned psychological safety, but the executive team still used a forced ranking performance system that eliminated the bottom 10% every year. You cannot have psychological safety and annual elimination. Those are contradictory systems, and every employee knew it. The values card was a reminder that leadership was either unaware of the contradiction or unwilling to address it. Both explanations damaged trust. This is the stage of the video where you might feel a heavy recognition. If you have been in the workforce for more than 5 years, you have lived inside at least 3 of these gaps. You have a memory of a mission statement that felt hollow, a value you saw violated, a meeting where the words did not match the silence. You have the data. Your body knows the pattern, and the investigator voice in this script is not telling you anything you do not already know. It is giving you permission to name it. Permission is not a small thing. When a system tells you the culture is authentic and your experience tells you it is not, the pressure to doubt your own perception is immense. The system has resources. It has experts. It has PowerPoint decks. You have only your nervous system. But your nervous system is more accurate than any deck, because your nervous system does not have a quarterly target to hit. It only has honesty. A 2022 study examined what happened when employees were given a tool to report cultural dissonance anonymously. The reports were detailed, specific. Employees described instances where values were invoked to justify decisions that contradicted those values. The organization ignored the reports for 8 months. Then the employee turnover reached 30%. The reports were suddenly taken seriously, but the damage was already done. The tool had not been designed to close the gap. It had been designed to measure the gap while doing nothing about it. Measurement without action is surveillance. Let me tell you what the path forward looks like for organizations that want to close the gap. There are 4 steps. First, audit the decision-making system, not the language. Identify every incentive that contradicts the stated values. Remove those incentives first. Do not rewrite the values. Fix the machine. Second, measure outcomes, not alignment. Stop asking employees whether they agree with the culture. Ask whether decisions consistent with the culture are rewarded. The answer to that question is the Real Culture Index. Third, reduce the emotional labor requirement. Stop requiring employees to demonstrate enthusiasm for values they did not create and cannot change. Enthusiasm is not a performance requirement. It is a byproduct of alignment. Fourth, accept that some employees will not fit the gap-free version of the culture. That is not a problem. That is honesty. When a consulting firm asked employees what would make them believe the culture was genuine, the most common answer was not better branding. It was not more town halls. It was consistency between what leaders say and what leaders do. The request was simple. Stop creating a gap. Most organizations cannot fulfill that request because they are unwilling to change the incentive system, and because they are unwilling, the gap persists. But you can stop participating in the gap internally. You can stop blaming yourself for feeling disconnected from a story that was never designed to be lived. You can hold both truths at once. I work here, and I do not believe the official version. That is not cynicism. That is accuracy. And accuracy, even when it is uncomfortable, is less expensive than pretending. Here is what I want you to remember from this video. When you were hired, you were told the culture was one thing. Then you started working and you discovered it was another thing. You tried to make the two things match. You failed. That failure was never yours. The gap existed before you arrived. It will exist after you leave. It is not a problem you can solve by believing harder. It is a structural contradiction in the design of the modern corporation. Your job was never to fix the gap. Your job is to stop being deceived by it. And now you have the forensic vocabulary to do that. When they say culture, you will ask, which culture? The one on the plaque or the one in the cabinet? When they say transparency, you will wait 28 days to see what was hidden. When they say family, you will check the severance policy. You are not broken. The system is performative. And the first step out of the performance is not believing it. If this hit you, save this video. Save it for the next time someone tells you to drink the Kool-Aid. Save it for the next values alignment meeting. Save it for the moment you need to remember that you were never the one who was wrong.